presentation for some questions. So we're thrilled today to be able to have Dr. Nadine Tatton join us. Nadine develops relationships with patient advocacy groups and key opinion leaders. She also provides expertise in frontotemporal dementia and other diseases to inform medical affairs outreach and disease state awareness for Elector, a biotechnology company developing immunoneurology-based treatments for FTD and related dementias. She is the Director of Medical Affairs and Advocacy Lead at Elector. Dr. Tatton received her PhD in physiology from the University of Toronto, followed by postdoctoral fellowships at the Montreal General Hospital and the Samuel Lunenfeld Institute at Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto. She has authored and co-authored more than 35 peer-reviewed publications in medical and scientific journals. So again, we're very pleased that she has agreed to speak with us today on the role of clinical trials. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Tatton. Welcome.
Hey, thank you very much, Matt. It's a lovely introduction, and it's nice to see everybody, and thank you for joining today. I am going to try to share my screen. Fair warning, I don't do these things seamlessly. I am not a technological whiz, so let's see what happens. Okay, and yep, first problem already. Let me just stop the share for a second. And I'm going to get rid of my video so it's not annoying. Okay. Okay, there we go. I'm not sure why it's pinging, but I think we'll have to live with it. Okay, so as Matt said, I'm Director of Medical Affairs at Elector, and I'm the lead for advocacy. Before that, I used to work for a nonprofit patient advocacy group called AFTD, the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration. And it's based in the United States, and it's focused on frontotemporal dementia. What you don't know about me, or many of you don't, is that I'm also a former caregiver. So my husband developed symptoms that looked like frontotemporal dementia when we were both working in the United States, but it was never accurately diagnosed, like many people who have FTD. And then he went on to also develop ALS, or also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. So I'm a former caregiver for someone who had what I believe are two rare diseases. So that's some of my impetus for joining a company that is developing drugs both for FTD and ALS, and also Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. So I'll just go to the next slide and tell you just a little bit about Elector. We're a fairly young biotech. We were started in 2013, and we've grown to just over 200 people, which to me is surprising. And we now have 4 different experimental treatments in early clinical trials. So what do we do at Elector, and what's our treatment about? So we're pioneering something called immunoneurology. And so what does that mean? It means that we're trying to create drugs that will target the immune system, and specifically the immune system in the brain. And that's disruptions to the immune system in the brain happen in neurological diseases. So we know that it happens in Alzheimer's disease, it happens in FTD, it happens in ALS, it happens in Parkinson's disease, it happens in multiple sclerosis. So Elector's idea is if we can target the immune system and manipulate that, we may be able to develop therapies and take a novel approach that just might be able to restore the brain environment to something a little bit more normal, more stable. So we've developed our treatments targeting the immune system, and we use genetic screening and different biomarkers to help identify the appropriate patients for our studies. So again, our targeting is done by genetic screening. We pick a gene target, I can tell you about, in frontotemporal dementia, we're looking at the progranulin gene mutation first. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. And then we have things called biomarkers. So they are objective measures of what's going on in the body. And we use that to help us understand how our treatment is working, how is the patient doing. And we also use these to help define and get the right people into the correct trial. And that, that sounds like a no-brainer, but it's actually harder than what it appears to be. So let's talk about clinical trials. And this is a very basic level talk on clinical trials, because I'm assuming that virtually none of you have ever been in a clinical trial. I certainly haven't. And there's a lot of terminology and a lot of different types of clinical trials. And I thought, let's all start off at the same place. So first of all, what are clinical trials and studies? Well, they're basically research studies, and they're performed in people, and they want to evaluate a medical or surgical or behavioral intervention. It can also test a new type of medical device. Sometimes they can also be clinical trials that they're testing a new PET tracer. And an example of that is in Alzheimer's disease. There's a protein called tau that accumulates in nerve cells, and there are different PET tracers aimed at illuminating tau in the brain when you do neuroimaging. So again, that would be a clinical trial when they develop a new one. Also, these clinical trials are designed to see if the new experimental therapy is more effective than an available standard treatment, or whether it has less side effects. So there's some really key questions that clinical trials have to answer. And the first one is always, is the treatment safe? It's the most important thing. The next one is, how well does that treatment work? Is it better than what's out there already? Is there anything out there at all? And that's the third question. Is it better than the standard treatment that's already used? Well, for many of you that have experience with frontotemporal dementia or Alzheimer's disease, you already know that there really isn't a treatment out there that's going to change the course of the disease. So, this is why there's so much interest in developing drugs for these different dementias. The last question we always want to know in a clinical trial is, what are the side effects and what are the risks of the treatment? Because this can vary with different people. So all critical questions that you need to answer when you're conducting a clinical trial. The most important thing about clinical trials are the volunteer participants, and that means you. So we need people who are healthy volunteers, and you'll often hear the term age-matched volunteers. We also need volunteers with the condition that's being studied. So both of those groups are extremely important. And information gathered from both groups really helps doctors and scientists understand the diseases better, think about new therapies, how to prevent and treat these diseases. So why are volunteers so important? I think there's a lot of reasons, and I think we've seen it lately, with the clinical trials for COVID vaccines. They benefit society by helping companies, researchers find better treatments for you and others in the future. They benefit society when there are no treatments, like we had no vaccine for COVID. And now we have a few in the pipeline and are getting approved and going to be delivered to different countries. Volunteers are also important because they help researchers discover better ways to fight diseases. So it's really a two-way street. There is so much that researchers learn from the patient and care partner volunteers in any clinical trial. They also help researchers find out if people process medicines in different ways. And again, this is important because in a clinical trial, you try to gather a very select group that doesn't have too many other diseases, other medications that they're dealing with, and fit into a definite age group, that they don't have other issues that would prevent them from participating in the trial if they're able to last throughout the duration of the trial. And that isn't exactly always what real life looks like in terms of the people that we are developing these drugs for, but it's the best way to test an experimental therapy without too many conflicting factors. Okay, so here we go to something that's really critical, And it's called the informed consent process. And this is something that I don't really think most websites talk much about. And this is very important to anybody who's ever going to volunteer in a clinical trial or any sort of research study. I think, first of all, an informed consent, it sounds like a formality, but it's important from a number of different perspectives. The first one is that you understand what's going to be required of you in that study. What side effects could possibly occur? How long is that your participation in the study going to be? The other one is your right to privacy. Again, very important. And depending on the trial, learning whether you will be in the placebo arm or the drug arm, and that's an option that isn't necessarily your choice, because as I'll tell you later, these trials get to be randomized, and even the doctors don't know which arm you are in as the trial goes on. Thirdly, the other thing that is often asked is whether you're willing to have your data shared for research purposes, but without identifying you as the participant. So sometimes you'll see a phrase called sharing data with third-party researchers. So these are people that are not the study sponsor or the clinical site doctors, but most often they're academic researchers who look at data and compare it to other scientific endeavors to see what else can they learn about the disease. What did that trial pull out that we didn't know before? It also helps us understand more about the volunteers, like the people that participate in clinical trials, and what's important, what are their concerns. So all of these things are important in the clinical consent, and this is something that you really want to take care as you're reading that process and understanding before you sign. If I can just change my slide, there we go. Okay, whoops, just one. Okay, so let's talk about de-identified data, because that's another phrase you'll hear. Also, instead of de-identified, sometimes you'll hear anonymized data, and it essentially means the same thing. So de-identification is a general term, and it's a process of removing any personally identifying information from a record or a data set, essentially what's collected in a clinical trial. It's important to realize that de-identification doesn't reduce the risk of re-identification of that data set to absolutely zero. There's a very small chance that the person's identity could be revealed, but it's very rare. But the process does produce data sets where that risk, as I said, is for re-identifying the person is very, very small. And as technology has gotten better, de-identification technology has also improved. So I don't know if I should stop here if anybody's got any questions before I go into a little bit more detail. Yes, no? Okay, I'll keep going. So let's talk about types of clinical trials. And this is something that you've probably heard. The first is a double-blinded trial. So here, the physician and the volunteer have no idea what treatment you're on, the participant is on. So there is a record, but there's a alphanumerical code that's usually put on the drug, whether it's pills, whether it's an injection, so that's held in a central location, and it's all organized by numbers and matched that way. So that's a double-blinded trial. What's a single-blind trial? Because sometimes you'll participate in one of these. And here, the physician knows what the volunteer is on, but the participant does not. And then finally, there's something called an open label trial. And here, the physician and the volunteer know what treatment that participant is on. So each of these types of trials have different roles as you're testing different drugs in development or different medical devices. So let's talk about clinical trial phases. This is something, again, that can take an incredibly long time, at least if you're a person with a disease and you're hoping for a treatment sooner rather than later. The preclinical phase is the first two blocks. So research studies in the lab and animal model research. So This part can take actually years and years, and it's really an accumulation of science that's going on internationally everywhere. And someone gets the bright idea of, oh, that particular cell pathway looks like something that might help me find a way to target cancer, or it might help me find a way to target Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease. So once that preclinical development has gone on and you have some candidate drugs that you could potentially use in a clinical trial, you then go through more screening through different animal models and try to identify what's your best candidate. And you may have 100 candidates to look for. So you have to prioritize which is the most likely to make it through into a in-human clinical trial. So once you've identified that candidate, then you go into phase 1. And phase 1 is sometimes called a safety study. So it's a very small number of patients, and you're really looking at the metabolism of that drug. You're looking at what's the right dose, and you're looking at safety. So are there any side effects in these people? Is there something that you didn't expect to happen when they were given this drug? So if the safety looks good, if that drug is actually making it to that part in the body that you want, so in our case, the brain, if all that makes sense, then you can move into phase 2. And phase 2, you're going to evaluate the safety even more. You've got more patients that you're enrolling. In most cases, phase 2 will have people that are in an active treatment arm, meaning they're getting the drug. Some people will be getting a placebo. Not always, but generally that's the way it's done. So you're just getting more numbers, more data, more assurance that the safety and effectiveness of the drug look good. Phase 2 will run longer than phase 1 quite often and includes more people. If phase 2 looks good, if that data is encouraging enough, then you'll move into a phase 3 trial. In phase 3, these are the largest numbers of patients. So in Alzheimer's disease, which is relatively common, unfortunately, the size of those trials can be 500 people, 1,000 people, 2,000 people. In a disease like frontotemporal dementia, which is a rare disease, if we can get 200 people in phase 3, we're really happy. And that's quite different. So again, we're trying to increase the number of patients because we want to have more confidence that what we saw in phase 2 wasn't just coincidence that we had a small number and it just worked in all those people because they were just the best people we could have found for the study. Phase 3 expands that. So the more people you test, you can increase the chances of it not working or revealing that your drug wasn't as good as you thought it was in phase 2. But phase 3, if you've got more people and the safety continues to look good and you see that the drug appears to be effective in a significant number of people in phase 3, and that it looks better than any current treatment or there's no treatment, then when you've finished your data analysis of phase 3 and that looks good, then the next step is usually applying to a regulatory agency, have them look at the data. So this would be like the FDA in the United States or the EMA in Europe, and say, okay, can you give us a drug approval so that we don't have to call this an experimental therapy anymore, and we can call it an approved drug. So those are the different phases of clinical trials. And currently, like phase 3 trials, if you're enrolled in one, they may last 12 months, they may last 24 months. There are some that have lasted longer than that. So again, these are all the things that go on if you're enrolled in a clinical trial. And this is why you want to pay attention to the informed consent. Are you able to fulfill the requirements for the trial? Can you go through that entire duration of the study? So those are the basics. So if there's, I think I'll just stop there and see if anyone's got any questions. Oops.
So Nadine, I'm not sure if you can see if you have access to the chat box.
I did, and now I just lost it.
Okay.
So
So I'll read it. This comes from Len. He says, I have a number of health issues that have led to a daily regime of medicinal drugs. Does that eliminate me from participating in a trial except for a phase 3?
Not not necessarily, Len. You know, when you look at a clinical trial where the information is posted, and we'll get to that in a second, there will usually be a list of what are the inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. So they tend to be fairly specific about certain drugs that they would exclude from the trial, depending on what the experimental treatment is. So, you know, you still may be eligible for a trial. The exclusion criteria often include like other health issues. So sometimes, you know, you'll often see if you're pregnant or nursing, you can't participate in a trial. If you're under 18, you can't participate in the trial. If you have some other, like for some studies, if you have an autoimmune disorder, they may not want you to participate in a trial. So it's always going to be different depending on what the trial is. So I would say you need to talk to your physician and look at, you know, what the inclusion exclusion criteria are and see if you're eligible. Hope that helps.
Thanks for your question, Len.
Yeah.
Again, the chat box is open there. If anyone, as Dr. Patton goes through her presentation, feel free to add them and I can share them with her.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. All right, so I'll move to the next slide. So one easy, well, I don't want to use the word easy and clinicaltrials.gov in the same sentence, but this is one way to search for clinical trials that are ongoing. And clinicaltrials.gov, it is a US-based site, but it records clinical trials that are happening in virtually any country. So if you look at the little search box on that page where it says find a study, you can plug in the country. You can plug in whatever the disease condition is. And then if you know the clinical trial number or you know the name of the doctor who is running a trial at a specific site, you can also search that way. So I will say that even though I'm a scientist, I don't have a lot of fun searching things on clinicaltrials.gov because it's a little bit awkward. So here, you know, we plugged in a couple of search terms. We plugged in FTD, so short for frontotemporal dementia. And what you can see is that it pulled up 205 studies. So that's good because it means that there's a lot of activity in frontotemporal dementia for clinical trials. But if you're looking for something specific, you'd probably want to use one of the boxes on the left that tells you what's the recruitment status of that trial. Is it enrolling? Is it completed? Is it not active? Or is it not yet recruiting, but likely will be? So lots of different things you can see on clinicaltrials.gov. So there'll be the status on that worksheet that you see that lists all the studies. You'll get the title of the study. You'll see which conditions this is treating. It will describe the intervention. So here, one of the things that's worth noticing is that it's not always a drug, like it's not always a pill or an injection that you're getting. Sometimes it's a non-invasive procedure, and the very top one is transcranial alternating current stimulation. And that's shown a lot of success in Alzheimer's disease and frontotemporal dementia. So again, all kinds of things can be tested in a clinical trial. If you look at number 4 on the bottom, the drug is called flutarcipir, but that's a PET tracer. So they're going to test, you know, that latest iteration of a screening agent for neuroimaging in that clinical study. So again, all kinds of options in clinical trials, and you can see them all on clinicaltrials.gov. So this is one of the easiest ones, you know, to search. There are different clinical trial sites for Asia. I think there might be another one for Europe, but this is probably the most comprehensive of any of the ones that are out there. So you can find out a lot of information here. It just takes patience. So now that we've sort of got a level playing field for where we are on clinical trials, I'm just going to ask Matt, are there any other questions in the chat box?
Who is responsible for keeping clinicaltrials.gov up to date?
Okay, that would be our friends at the US National Library of Medicine, and that's at NIH. So they are the keeper of that site. And if you have a clinical trial, you apply to have it listed on the study page. The only thing that I've found that just doesn't always seem to get up to date is if there's, when you click on a trial, and there's usually a tab that says, reporting on, what's happened in the study so far, usually nobody fills that in. So, and I don't think anyone at the National Institutes of Health has time to track them down either. But that's who looks after it. So NIH is a government agency. You've probably all heard about Dr. Fauci, so he works for NIH.
And then there's another question. Is there a Canadian equivalent to the US National Library of Medicine?
Not that I know of, but if you're looking for clinical trials in Canada, you can search them on this site. They will turn up when you put in the country.
Okay.
And the other thing, I didn't want to do this live because that's always kind of iffy, but if you click on the name of the clinical study in any one of these lines, then that clicks you into the page with more information. That's the page that will tell you what inclusion and exclusion criteria are. It will tell you what the experimental treatment is. It will also, if it's usually being kept up to date, which are the recruiting sites. And that's where you can look at, are there any sites in Canada recruiting for this particular study?
Okay. All right. Thank you for those questions.
Okay. So now we'll move on and we'll talk about some of the experimental therapies that Alector is developing. So the first one has the imaginative name of AL001. And this is the treatment that Alector has developed for frontotemporal dementia. So this is just a screenshot of what the Alector portfolio of drug development looks like right now. So up at the top, you can see AL001. We've developed this drug to treat frontotemporal dementia, and specifically for people who carry the progranulin mutation, abbreviated as GRN, or people who are carrying the C9orf72 gene mutation. And both of those gene mutations are known to be causal for FTD, and that's why they're targeted here. The one thing I noted before is that FTD is a rare disease, so that means maybe less than, excuse me, 200,000 people in the United States have FTD. So if you're going to take that smaller group that have FTD due to a gene mutation, there's even fewer people. So, around the world, maybe there's 15,000 people with FTD with the progranulin gene mutation. I don't know how many have the C9orf72 mutation, but it wouldn't be, much larger than that. It might even be smaller. So again, FTD is a rare disease, but when we go farther down and we've got a couple treatments for Alzheimer's disease, I'll talk about that once we get past the FTD. So again, any company that you go to, you're always going to see a drug pipeline screen. There's usually a pull down tab of drugs in development. So this is something that you can use to inform yourself of what's available. If you can't find something on clinicaltrials.gov, you can go to any company and see what they've got in development. Also, the thing to look at is, whether it's in the research phase. So of ours, we've got all these with the ADP, they're still in the research phase. So that preclinical development that I talked about before. Also preclinical, we've got drugs that we're developing for cancer. So these are probably moving into animal models. And then, are you in phase 1? So we've got one drug here that's moving into phase 1. Our FTD for the C9 mutation is moving into phase 2. And here you can see that the one for the FTD with the progranulin mutation is moving into phase 3. So it's a fairly simple way to read what drug a company has, as well as what stage is it at, and is there an opportunity for you to participate in a clinical trial, because you can see what phase it's in, and is it in clinical trial or is it still in preclinical. So what have we got at Elector? Well, we've developed something called a monoclonal antibody therapeutic, and we're using that to modulate the brain's immune system in FTD. So I'm sure some of you know what a monoclonal antibody is, but if you don't, it's like the name says, it's from a single clone. And the way they're developed is you inject what's called an antigen, which is usually a protein, into a mouse, and it develops antibodies. And then you take a group of cells from the spleen that are producing the antibodies, and you fuse that cell with a cell line that just keeps growing. It's called an immortalized cell line. So then you've got this fused cell that's just going to make antibodies for you forever. And so you grow up clones of that single cell, and they are all monoclonal. They will keep producing just one antibody that's identical across all of those clones. So that's what a monoclonal antibody does. And it's very much like antibodies that you make normally in your immune system when you get a flu virus, or you get the measles, or you get some other, invading pathogen, and that's the immune system creating a defense against that invader. So we're trying to do that same approach, but using it in the brain, because we know that the brain also has inflammatory and anti-inflammatory capacity, and that it can be modulated. And we know that in neurodegenerative diseases like FTD, like Alzheimer's, like Parkinson's, et cetera, that the brain's immune system has moved into a more inflammatory state as opposed to its normal balanced state. So for FTD with progranulin, progranulin is a protein that's been shown to participate in modulating the immune response in the brain. So what it can do is it can, jack it up so that it's a little bit more pro-inflammatory, or it can tamp it down so it's more anti-inflammatory. So it's always a balance going on in these systems. So in FTD that's caused by the progranulin gene mutation, what happens is there's less progranulin available in the brain, and the microglial cells that are in the brain become activated, and because there's less progranulin, and this contributes to a pro-inflammatory state. So microglia are, like their name says, they're very small cells, and they support the healthy function of nerve cells, and they help maintain a normal environment in the brain. So what Elector did was develop an antibody, and this is AL001, and it's in clinical development, which means it's in a clinical trial. So it binds to a receptor on microglial cells, and that receptor is called sortilin. And sortilin processes progranulin for recycling. So whenever a cell makes something, there's also got to be a way to process it so that it just doesn't pile up. So this is what sortilin does, and it takes progranulin from the environment surrounding a nerve cell, and it puts it into the cell and processes it and breaks it down. And then, you just keep a balance of progranulin. But in a patient that's got, not even half of the normal levels of progranulin, then you've got an altered immune system state in the brain, and it's inflammatory. So by binding to this with our antibody to the sortilin receptor, we're blocking that receptor, and we believe that blocking that antibody can help raise the levels of progranulin in the brain and help the brain return to a more neutral immune state. And by returning to a more neutral immune state, you've got healthier nerve cells that have a chance to function in a more normal way. So that's the theory behind our monoclonal antibody AL001.
Nadine, can I just interrupt? There was a question
Sure.
from Larry. He said, you mentioned the spleen for making antibodies for anyone. So for anyone who's missing a spleen, would they have problems building antibodies?
Yeah, because this is where that particular group of B cells comes from. And I have to say that I can't really say more than that, because the last time I took a course in immunology, was like in the last century, and I'm really not kidding. That's when I was a student. So I think, you know, you would have difficulty doing it. It doesn't mean that that's the only immune response that goes on, because there's also an acute inflammatory response that the body also produces. And there are cells called macrophages in the periphery that when you've got like a cut or some kind of injury, they'll go to the injury site and they'll start cleaning up any bacteria or other invasive organisms that are at that site of injury. And they'll also clean up cell debris. So actually, that's what the microglia also do in the brain. So that's how they help maintain a normal environment. So yes, that's the best answer I've got to your question.
Okay, and thank you for the question there, Larry.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we've done phase 1 for AL001, and our phase 2 trial is still ongoing because we still wanted to enroll more people. And like everyone else, we've been experiencing, you know, the effects of COVID and people not being able to come to clinical sites. And, you know, if you're already compromised by having an illness, then it's even more difficult. So the phase 1 trial was there to determine, is our monoclonal antibody therapy working? And so to test that, we measured the level of circulating progranulin in the blood. And the other thing that we tested is whether different biomarkers in the blood are changing. So biomarkers act as an objective measure of changes happening in the body. So, you know, for example, blood glucose levels, that's a great biomarker for monitoring diabetes and the need for insulin. So for dementia and FTD, but also Alzheimer's disease, we look at biomarkers that reflect neurodegeneration, and we also measure biomarkers that reflect inflammation in the brain. So the advantage of, you know, technology and science is that 10 years ago, we didn't really know all of these biomarkers. And I'm sure, you know, 10 years from now, we'll probably have even a better handle on which biomarkers you know, do which specific reflection of different states. So just as an example, there's different types of microglial populations in the brain. And there are unique markers for each of them to tell us, you know, are they inflamed, activated microglia that are busy chewing up, you know, nerve cells and other things in the brain, or are they just happy, you know, normal sentinel microglia, which is what they're called, and they're just monitoring everything and there's no inflammatory state. So, you know, it's sometimes drug development is also dependent on where the science is at any one time. So for AL001, which is for treating FTD with progranulin, we are now in a phase 3 study, and we started that in July of this year. So if you remember the previous slide where I talked about double-blinded studies, single-blinded studies, and open-label studies, this is where we're putting it into practice. So a randomized double-blinded placebo-controlled study means that all the participants that enter, they are randomized into either the drug, which is also called the active arm, or the placebo arm. And no one knows who's in what arm. And the advantage and the reason for that is that you don't really want to prejudice the data analysis that's going to be moving forward. And you want to try to be as neutral as you can if you're the person leading the investigation at a particular site. So this is why we randomize. This is why these are double-blinded. Let me say a little bit about placebo controls as well. I mean, these are absolutely vital. And I know sometimes people are upset if they're put in the placebo arm, but it is such a valuable arm of the study. It tells us how well that drug is working. So without it, we have nothing to compare the active drug arm to. So we need a placebo arm, and that participation by the volunteer is absolutely vital. The other thing is that when you look for regulatory approval, if your phase 3 trial goes well, regulatory agencies will insist that there be a placebo comparison. So again, there's all these steps, checks and balances that you have to have in place for a clinical trial. So our phase 3 clinical trial is enrolling. It is ongoing. We're looking specifically in this one, AL001, it's called the INFRONT study as well, at one single dose of the drug, which is 60 milligrams per kilogram, and it's done by IV injection. It's an antibody, and it's every 4 weeks for up to 96 weeks. So when I said some of these studies can be very long, yes, this is a long trial. After the trial is over, then there's another 8 weeks looking at follow-up, because you want to make sure everyone is still doing well, that there are no other safety issues that have come up. And then if the option is there, and in our study it will be, there is the open label extension. And as you remember before, when I talked about open label, if you're the volunteer, you know that what you're getting, and the physician giving you the treatment also knows what you're getting. So a participant can choose to be in that extension of the trial, and that gives us more information, because it's a longer period of time to evaluate the drug safety as well as the drug efficacy. So these are all the things that go on. Are there questions?
So there are particular to this treatment here. The question is, can this particular treatment help slow the progression of the FTD progranulin at any stage, or does it only work at the early stages?
That is a brilliant question, and there's no answer to it. I'm hoping that after the phase 3 is over, that we might have an answer to that. So if you look on clinicaltrials.gov, the entry criteria for the study is that you have to have the progranulin gene mutation. And then the other requirement is that there is a biomarker that we're looking at. It's called neurofilament. And that has to be at a certain level. And that's, the other entry requirement, because we don't want someone who is so early in the disease progression that we wouldn't see a change in them over the 2 years of the study. We want them to be at a point where we know they're becoming symptomatic, and that if we're giving them the treatment, we should be able to see whether the treatment is slowing the progression down or not. So it's a really good question. And this, oops, sorry, my dog's barking in the background. So this is what we're trying to do. The other thing that I should explain is that, for any of these gene mutation caused diseases, and specifically here for FTD with progranulin, there's what's called the pre-symptomatic phase. So if you're a gene carrier and you've got that mutation, you may not have any symptoms. You may not develop symptoms till you're in your 40s. You may not develop symptoms till you're in your 60. So there's that pre-symptomatic phase where there's no clinical test that can tell you where you are in the course of the disease. So, that's the other difficult thing about these studies. And this is why we're using the neurofilament biomarker to give us some idea. Are you close to becoming symptomatic? Are you symptomatic? Are you at risk for developing the disease, where a clinical test will show, yes, you show symptoms of FTD.
Okay. And I do believe you just answered the second question. Is everybody informed of what gene mutation they have, or if they even have one?
That's a really good question. So for some studies, it's kept confidential even from the participant. The data stays with the study sponsor. For the Electra trial for FTD progranulin, the phase 3 study, it's required that you have genetic screening. We are also running another study that's called PGFTD, and we are paying for a company in the United States called Inform DNA to do the genetic counseling and screening for FTD progranulin. So if you enroll in that study for the screening, then you will be informed whether you carry the gene or not, depending on how you've responded to the genetic counseling. Because it's one thing to say, yes, I want to be screened, and you're going to get the result. But when you get that phone call from the genetic counselor saying, I know the results, let's find a time to talk about it, it carries a lot of emotional burden. So for this study, you will likely be required to know whether you've got the progranulin gene or not. There are many people that come from progranulin families, so they've got a good likelihood based on family history that they have it, but they still need to be screened.
Okay, thank you for that.
Okay, so now just to wrap up, we've got 2 drugs that are also, experimental therapies that are in early phase clinical trials, and these are for Alzheimer's disease. So again, with the imaginative names AL002 and 003. So Alzheimer's disease is, I think the title where it says it's a significant unmet need is probably a huge understatement. If COVID is the pandemic of the virus world, Alzheimer's is definitely the pandemic of the dementia world. There's almost 6 million people affected in the United States. And if there's no disease-modifying treatments, we're expecting that may be as many as 14 million people by 2050. And that's not really that far away. It's the 6th leading cause of death in the United States. It's also the most common form of dementia. It affects an older population than FTD. FTD tends to affect people in midlife in their 40s and 50s. It can also affect people as young as 28 or 30. So Alzheimer's tends to be more of the elderly population, so people 65 and over, though there is also an early onset Alzheimer's disease. So previous drug development programs have always focused on one of the pathologies of Alzheimer's disease. So they've tried to target beta amyloid, or they've tried to target tau proteins. And so far they haven't yielded success. Everyone is looking at the FDA right now and what will be the decision on Biogen's most recent treatment, the aducanumab antibody, which is again against beta amyloid. So we'll see if that becomes an approved therapy or not. So for Alector, again, this is the drug pipeline that I showed before. So we've got 2 drugs in development for Alzheimer's disease. So one is just into phase 1, the other is enrolling in phase 2. So AL002 is a monoclonal antibody, again, like our FTD drug, and it's designed to alter the progress of Alzheimer's disease. And it's attacking something called the TREM2 protein. So TREM2 is expressed by microglia, again, our favorite target cell, and it's involved in the immune response. So if we activate TREM2, our hypothesis is that we can reduce the pathology that is found in Alzheimer's disease. And we can do that by helping microglia go back to a more normal state and be less pro-inflammatory and be more anti-inflammatory and trying to create a nice, healthy environment again in the brain. So Alector has just initiated the phase 2 for AL002 this year. And again, we are starting to enroll for that one. AL003 is another monoclonal antibody in clinical development. And similar to 002, it's designed to alter the course of Alzheimer's disease, but this time it's going to bind to a protein called Siglec-3, and it's a receptor, again, on microglial cells. And Siglec-3, again, is another protein involved in the immune response, and you can see a trend here of why we're targeting microglia, because they really are responsible for modulating a lot of the immune environment in the brain. So if we block Siglec-3, we hypothesize that we can reduce the amount of pathology again found in Alzheimer's disease. And this is an early phase clinical trial, so we're just starting phase 1. And that's what we've got right now for frontotemporal dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And this is a quote from our founder, Arnon Rosenthal, that we envision a world where dementia and neurodegeneration are illnesses of the past, just like smallpox and polio. So, fingers crossed. We have, what's encouraging to me is so many different companies involved in new types of therapies for frontotemporal dementia and Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's and multiple sclerosis, that technology has caught up with a lot of the imagination of the scientists, so that I think we've got a better chance than ever of having success with a drug. Someone's got to have success. And that's it. That's the talk.
Well, thank you for that. Very informative, and certainly opens a door to the whole world of clinical trials. There's so much behind them, obviously, that goes in there. I'm sure you said there's about 200 people there at Elector?
There is now. We just got, I think, about 220 or so. And when I joined in June, I think we were at maybe 120 people. So because our clinical trial programs are expanding, we're needing to hire more and more people to support that side of the company. So really, when I joined, it was a lot of scientists, medical affairs. There are 2 of us right now. And then we're just building out the rest of the company as we start to, expand the clinical trials and move from the early phases to the phase 3, the larger trials.
Okay. So we have a few minutes left. We did say we'd go to 4:30. It's now about 4:25. Does anyone have questions for Dr. Tatton?
I have a question. First of all, this was so interesting. Thank you very much. The question I had, you mentioned you're still looking for people for your phase 3 trial of the one of the studies, I forget the number. And so if people are interested in participating, what is the process?
Okay, there's a couple ways to do it. And I'm glad you reminded me, because the one thing I forgot to say is that there is a Canadian site that is open now for AL001. So it's for FTD with progranulin gene mutation. And that's in Toronto. And that's led by Dr. Mario Marcelis at Sunnybrook Hospital. So there's 2 ways you can do it. You can look at clinicaltrials.gov and type in the InFront study, or type in Elector, and you can pull up the trial there. Or you can come to the Elector website, or you can send me an email. And we also have some ads, I think, on Facebook that can connect you with somebody who will answer a question. But I'd say, email me. I can put you in touch with the right person. Look at clinicaltrials.gov, look at the Elector website. We are updating the Elector website. It's going through a huge revamping, so we don't necessarily have all the information you need up there, but that's one place to look. I'm sorry, my dog is barking at dangerous squirrels.
So how would, to those who may be sort of on the fence of either themselves, those living with dementia, or perhaps their care partner, what might you say to them to investigate or move forward in the process of perhaps moving towards enrolling in a drug trial?
I'd say inform yourself, ask a lot of questions, because for me, it's always been that phrase, knowledge is power, is really true. That the more you know, the better you're able to make a decision about something. So I'd say, look at what you can find on the Elector website. We're not the only company making drugs for FTD or Alzheimer's disease. As much as, people, dish on, how everyone's become a PhD or an MD on Google searches, you can still find some useful information there. I do like, different medical sites, like the Mayo Clinic always has a lot of great information about almost anything. So inform yourself, email the people who are in medical affairs at any company. They're usually the ones who speak to advocates, patients, as well as, clinical experts. So we're kind of an information exchange place as well. Our website isn't really up to speed yet in terms of disease state awareness, and we don't have our advocacy site up yet, but we're getting there. So I would say just try to learn as much as you can.
Okay, thank you for that. Are there any other questions before we wrap up? Len? Len, if you're able to unmute yourself there, please.
I'm a motivator and a recruiter, and I'd like to see a lot of other people participate in these types of studies. How do I go about recruiting characters that fit the needs in this in this situation?
Yeah.
I have a lot of contacts that are not directly known by most people. So
yeah, I'd say there's a couple ways to do it. I know it may be different in Canada than the United States. So here we have disease advocacy organizations. So AFTD, the place that I worked at for 7 years, it's focused on FTD disorders. And they always have a page that tells you, where disease experts are, as well as what's the current state of trial and research opportunities available. And they also have like a program department, so people that can talk to you, as well as a list of support groups across the country. Alzheimer's Association is another good one in the United States. I'm sure there's an Alzheimer's group in Canada as well. ALS Association in Canada, also a great place. So I think those places, sometimes they'll let you post an announcement or, get the word out that way. I don't know what Dementia Canada, what your policies are on informing people about clinical trial opportunities.
Well, this is really our first opportunity to kind of open this up to the topic. So I've just posted in the chat there the link to the AFTD and the clinical trials.
Okay. Also, I mean, the NIH website is a great place to find information, and they will also direct you to, what other disease advocacy groups are out there. But in terms of recruiting people, Len, that it's always like a little bit tricky. Like I know you can reach out to people personally. But, internally at any company, we also have like a patient recruitment task force as well that is, trying to figure that out too.
I've recently come across a list of people virtually everywhere in Canada and the US and India, a third country. And I'd like to make an open invitation to that large group to participate in these types of trials. So if I can do it virtually anonymously. I don't know whether that's a good idea or not. If I just give them suggest a place where they may go and participate in such a program. Is it? Would you say that's a possibility?
So Dr. Tatton, you're on mute.
Sorry, yeah, I have a tricky mouse problem and a barking dog. It's kind of an awkward position to be in, Len, to, advertise to people that way, because I don't know if there'd be repercussions, whether people would see that as, being intrusive or not. Most people tend to be searching disease advocacy websites. They tend to search companies and they'll do, just general Google searches. So you know, I don't know if you have a Twitter feed, if you want to, encourage people that way.
No, this is a group of people who have an interest in dementia. And
Okay.
if I were to approach them, I don't think anybody would because they know publicly,
Mhm.
their names are out there. So I think if I approach them, nobody would be offended. It's not the sort of issue because they've already indicated a pretty deep interest.
Yeah. I have to say, I don't really know what's the best way to do it. And I don't know if I'm allowed to comment on that because I work for a company.
So I'm just being mindful of the time here. So I think we'll wrap up with that. So on behalf of everyone at Dementia Advocacy Canada, Dr. Tatton, we'd like to thank you for your presentation today on the role of clinical trials, specifically with FTD, and just really opening it up for us to investigate further, those of us who are living with dementia and those of us with who are care partners for our loved ones. So we'd like to thank you, and thank you to all of you for joining us here today. As usual, you get your weekly DAC mail out. Okay, lots of initiatives going on. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll talk to everyone soon.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank you
Matt.
all.
Appreciate the chance to talk to you all, and nice to visit Canada, even if it's virtual.
Okay. All right.
Not too cold.